In 1484, a young woman named Elvira del Campo was stripped naked, tied to a wooden table, and had her limbs slowly stretched until her joints popped and her screams echoed through the stone chambers of Toledo. Her crime, being accused of secretly practicing Judaism. Welcome to the Spanish Inquisition, where faith became a weapon and heresy meant death. What you're about to hear is not fiction. It's not exaggerated medieval folklore or Hollywood dramatization. This is the documented, archived, meticulously recorded history of humanity's most systematic campaign of religious terror. For 3.5 centuries, longer than the United States has existed as a nation, an institution operated across Spain and its vast empire with one singular purpose: to purify souls through the destruction of bodies. The year was 1478. Pope Sixtus IV, from his throne in Rome, issued a papal bull with the Latin title Exigit Sinceras Devotionis Affectus. In plain terms, it meant sincere devotion demands, but what it demanded would reshape the very soul of Spain forever. This single document gave birth to what would become Europe's most sophisticated torture machine, disguised as divine mission. Picture Spain in the late 15th century. It wasn't yet the unified nation we know today. Instead, imagine a patchwork of kingdoms, cultures, and faiths. Christians, Muslims, and Jews had coexisted for centuries in what historians call medieval Spain's convivencia, its living together. The Iberian Peninsula was a crossroads of civilizations, where Islamic scholars preserved ancient Greek texts, Jewish philosophers advanced mathematics and medicine, and Christian theologians debated theology. It was, in many ways, the most intellectually vibrant corner of Europe, but this diversity was about to become a death sentence. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had recently married, uniting two powerful kingdoms and creating what would become modern Spain. The final Muslim stronghold of Granada was about to fall, completing what the Spanish called the Reconquista, the reconquest. After nearly 8 centuries of warfare, Christian forces were finally pushing the last Muslim rulers from Spanish soil. Victory was within reach, but victory brought an unexpected problem. What to do with the hundreds of thousands of Muslims and Jews who had called Spain home for generations? The solution they chose would haunt Spain for centuries. It began with a concept that sounds almost clinical in its modern translation: limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. But don't let the academic language fool you. This wasn't some abstract theological concept. This was the ideological foundation for systematic persecution on a scale Europe had never seen. The newly unified Spanish monarchs faced a dilemma. How do you create national unity from religious diversity? How do you transform a multi-faith society into a unified Catholic kingdom? Their answer was terrifyingly simple. You don't convert it, you terrorize it into submission. What started as religious purification became Europe's most sophisticated torture machine. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't just about rooting out heresy. It was about creating a new kind of society, one built on fear, surveillance, and the absolute certainty that deviation from orthodoxy meant destruction. Before we dive deeper into this machinery of terror, we need to understand the minds that created it. The architects of this system weren't madmen or religious fanatics acting in passionate frenzy. They were calculating, intelligent administrators who approached the systematic destruction of human lives with the same methodical precision that others might use to plan a harvest or design a cathedral. The most feared name in this story belongs to a Dominican friar named Tomás de Torquemada. History remembers him as the first Grand Inquisitor, but that title barely captures the scope of his influence. Torquemada wasn't just enforcing existing religious law. He was inventing new methods of detecting, prosecuting, and punishing heresy. Under his guidance, the Inquisition developed procedures so thorough, so psychologically sophisticated, that they would influence legal systems for centuries to come. Torquemada had grown up in the monastery of Santa Cruz in Segovia, rising through the Dominican order to become prior of the monastery of Santa Cruz. But his real talent wasn't for prayer or scholarship. It was for organization. He possessed an administrator's mind applied to the business of souls. When Isabella of Castile chose him as her confessor, she was placing the spiritual guidance of the future Spanish monarchy in the hands of a man who believed that heresy was not just a sin to be forgiven, but a disease to be surgically removed from the body politic. Working alongside Torquemada was Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, a figure perhaps even more influential but far less remembered by popular history. While Torquemada provided the zealous drive, Cisneros provided the intellectual framework. He was a scholar, a linguist, and a brilliant administrator who understood that lasting religious transformation required more than fear. It required the complete reconstruction of Spanish intellectual life. Together, these men created something unprecedented in European history. The Suprema, the Supreme Council of the Inquisition. This wasn't just a religious court. It was a parallel government structure that operated across all Spanish territories with authority that in many cases superseded that of local nobles and even bishops. The Suprema answered directly to the Spanish crown, making it one of the first truly centralized institutions in European history. By 1482, just 4 years after that initial papal bull, the first permanent tribunals had been established in Seville, Córdoba, and Ciudad Real. But these weren't traditional ecclesiastical courts. They were something entirely new. A fusion of religious authority and state power that created a legal system unlike anything Europe had ever seen. The genius of the Inquisition's legal framework lay not in its innovations, but in its perversions of existing law. Take the Roman legal principle that had governed European courts for over a millennium: the presumption of innocence. Under normal circumstances, accusers had to prove guilt. But the Inquisition inverted this entirely. Once accused of heresy, defendants were presumed guilty until they could prove their innocence, and the standards for proof were virtually impossible to meet. Consider the practical implications of this system. If someone accused you of secretly practicing Judaism, you couldn't know who your accuser was. You couldn't see the evidence against you. You couldn't have proper legal representation. Your only option was to confess to crimes you may never have committed or face torture designed to extract that confession from you. And if you confessed under torture, that confession was considered valid. But if you later recanted, claiming you only confessed to stop the pain, you were considered a relapsed heretic and burned alive. The psychological sophistication of this system is breathtaking in its cruelty. The Inquisition understood that the most effective control comes not from random violence, but from the certainty that deviation will be detected and punished. To achieve this certainty, they created something unprecedented in European history: a surveillance state. The familiars were the backbone of this system. These were ordinary Spanish citizens, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, minor nobles, who served as the eyes and ears of the Inquisition. They weren't paid agents or professional informants. They were volunteers who saw collaboration with the Holy Office as both a religious duty and a path to social advancement. At its height, the network of familiars included over 20,000 people spread across Spain and its territories. Imagine living in such a society. Your neighbor, your business partner, your servant, even members of your own family might be watching for signs of heretical behavior. Did you change your clothes on Saturday? Did you avoid eating pork? Did you light candles on Friday evening? Did you wash your hands before prayer in a way that seemed too ritualistic? Any of these behaviors, innocent as they might seem, could trigger an investigation that would destroy not just your life, but the lives of your children and grandchildren. The Inquisition's reach extended far beyond Spain itself. As Spanish conquistadors claimed vast territories in the Americas, as Spanish merchants established trading posts across the Mediterranean, as Spanish armies conquered kingdoms in Italy and the Low Countries, the Inquisition followed. Tribunals were established in Mexico City, Lima, Cartagena, Palermo, and dozens of other cities. By the mid-16th century, over 100 permanent tribunal offices operated across the Spanish Empire, making the Inquisition one of history's first truly global institutions. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of the Inquisition's scope is its duration. When we talk about historical atrocities, we often think in terms of years or decades. The Holocaust lasted 12 years. The Stalinist purges spanned roughly 2 decades. The Cambodian genocide lasted 4 years. The Spanish Inquisition operated for 354 years. Think about that. It outlasted entire civilizations. It was older than the United States, older than the British Empire, older than the concept of the modern nation-state itself. During those 3.5 centuries, the machinery of persecution evolved and refined itself with each generation. What began as a relatively crude system of religious enforcement became something far more sophisticated, a science of suffering that would influence authoritarian regimes well into the modern era. The torture methods employed by the Inquisition were not the random brutalities of angry mobs or the improvised cruelties of individual sadists. They were carefully designed, precisely regulated, and systematically applied techniques that had been studied, refined, and documented with academic thoroughness. The Inquisition didn't just practice torture, it turned torture into a scholarly discipline. The most commonly used method was called the toca, or water torture. The victim was strapped to an inclined board with their head lower than their feet. A cloth was placed over their face, and water was slowly poured over the cloth, creating the sensation of drowning without actually killing the victim. The psychological impact was devastating. The victim experienced all the terror of drowning while remaining fully conscious and aware that their tormentors could continue this process indefinitely. The potro, or rack, was perhaps the most feared device in the Inquisition's arsenal. The victim was tied to a wooden frame with ropes attached to their wrists and ankles. As the ropes were slowly tightened, the victim's limbs were stretched until joints dislocated and tendons tore. The horror of the potro wasn't just the immediate pain. It was the knowledge that each turn of the mechanism brought permanent injury that would cripple the victim for life. Then there was the garrocha, or strappado. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. Heavy weights were then attached to their feet, causing the shoulder joints to dislocate and the arms to tear from their sockets. The agony was so intense that many victims lost consciousness within minutes, but the Inquisition had solutions for that too. They would lower the victim just enough to revive them, then raise them again. But the true genius of the Inquisition's torture system wasn't in the devices themselves. It was in the psychological framework that surrounded their use. The Inquisition understood that the anticipation of pain could be more effective than pain itself. Victims were often brought to the torture chamber and shown the devices without being immediately subjected to them. They were stripped naked and bound to the apparatus, while inquisitors calmly explained exactly what was about to happen to their bodies. This process, called the interrorism, was often enough to extract confessions without any physical torture at all. The psychological warfare extended far beyond the torture chamber. The Inquisition created elaborate public rituals designed to humiliate the condemned while reinforcing the power of the institution. The most famous of these was the auto de fe, literally meaning act of faith. These were massive public spectacles that combined religious ceremony, theatrical performance, and public execution into events that could last for days and draw audiences of tens of thousands. Picture the scene: a raised platform in the central plaza of a major Spanish city, religious banners and crosses decorating every surface, hundreds of clergy in elaborate vestments, government officials in their finest court dress, and in the center of it all, the condemned, dressed in yellow robes called sanbenitos that marked them as heretics for all to see. The sanbenito wasn't just a garment, it was a carefully designed instrument of psychological torture. Different patterns and symbols indicated different crimes and different fates. Some bore images of flames pointing upward, indicating that the wearer would be burned alive. Others showed flames pointing downward, meaning the wearer had repented and would be strangled before burning. Still, others bore crosses and other symbols indicating various forms of public penance. But the cruelty of the sanbenito extended even beyond death. After executions, these garments were hung in local churches with the names of the condemned written on them. They remained there for generations, ensuring that the shame of heresy would follow the victim's family for decades. In some Spanish churches, sanbenitos from the 16th century were still hanging in the 19th century, maintaining the stigma of families whose ancestors had been condemned 300 years earlier. The Inquisition's approach to torture was governed by precise rules that reveal the institutional mindset behind the brutality. Torture sessions were limited in duration, usually no more than 1 hour at a time. No blood could be shed during torture, and no permanent maiming was allowed, at least not intentionally. The victim had to remain conscious throughout the ordeal, so techniques that caused unconsciousness were prohibited. And perhaps most cynically, torture could only be applied once for each charge, though the Inquisition developed creative interpretations of what constituted once, sometimes stretching single sessions across multiple days by claiming they were merely continuing rather than repeating the torture. Every aspect of torture sessions was meticulously documented. Inquisition scribes recorded not just confessions, but detailed descriptions of the torture methods used, the duration of each session, the victims' responses, and even their exact words. These records, thousands of pages of them, survive in Spanish archives today. They represent one of history's most comprehensive documentations of systematic torture, creating what amounts to an institutional memory of human suffering. The case of the Tuators of Mallorca provides a horrifying example of how this system operated on a community-wide scale. Between 1679 and 1691, the Inquisition conducted what amounted to a sustained campaign against the converso families of Palma. These were families whose ancestors had converted from Judaism generations earlier, but who were suspected of maintaining secret Jewish practices. The persecution began with the arrest of Raphael Valls, a wealthy merchant whose family had been Christian for over 2 centuries. Under torture, Valls was forced to implicate dozens of other families in a supposed conspiracy to secretly practice Judaism. What followed was a cascade of arrests, tortures, and confessions that eventually implicated over 25% of Palma's population. The economic impact was devastating. The Inquisition confiscated property before trials began, meaning that accused families lost everything regardless of whether they were eventually found guilty. Entire neighborhoods were emptied as families fled the island or were imprisoned. The social fabric of Palma was torn apart as neighbors informed on neighbors and families turned against each other under the pressure of investigation. Raphael Valls himself endured months of torture. The records describe session after session on the potro, with his limbs stretched until his joints separated. Between torture sessions, he was kept in solitary confinement in a cell so small he couldn't lie down. He was given just enough food to keep him alive and just enough water to prevent death from dehydration. The psychological pressure was as carefully calibrated as the physical torture, designed to break his will without killing his body. But Valls refused to confess to crimes he hadn't committed. Session after session, he maintained his innocence even as his body was systematically destroyed. The Inquisition records describe him as maintaining his dignity even under the most extreme torture, refusing to implicate innocent people even when doing so might have ended his suffering. In the end, Raphael Valls was burned alive in an auto-da-fe that drew spectators from across the Balearic Islands. But his resistance had consequences. His refusal to provide the detailed confessions the Inquisition wanted meant that the persecution of the Tuators continued for years longer than it might have otherwise. Hundreds of families suffered because one man chose martyrdom over collaboration. The story of the Tuators illustrates how the Inquisition targeted different groups with different strategies, each designed to maximize both the extraction of confessions and the destruction of community bonds. The conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, were perhaps the primary target of Inquisition persecution, but they were far from the only victims. The conversos were caught in an impossible position. Many had converted voluntarily during the massive pogroms of 1391, when anti-Jewish violence swept across Spain. Others had converted under the pressure of discriminatory laws that made it virtually impossible for Jews to earn a living or participate in public life. But conversion didn't bring safety. It brought scrutiny. The Inquisition developed elaborate methods for detecting crypto-Judaism, the secret practice of Jewish rituals by ostensible Christians. Investigators watched for families who changed their clothes on Saturdays, who lit candles on Friday evenings, who avoided eating pork or shellfish, who circumcised their sons, or who showed any knowledge of Hebrew prayers. Even behaviors that weren't specifically Jewish could be interpreted as suspicious. Showing too much grief at a funeral might be seen as evidence that the mourner didn't believe in Christian resurrection. The case of Maria Gonzalez illustrates the impossibility of the converso position. Maria was a woman in her 50s whose family had been Christian for 3 generations. She worked as a seamstress in Toledo and attended Mass regularly. Her crime. A neighbor reported that she had been seen lighting candles on Friday evening. When arrested, Maria explained that she lit candles every evening because her eyesight was poor and she needed the light to continue working after sunset. But the Inquisition investigators saw this as a clever deception. Obviously, she was secretly observing the Jewish Sabbath. Under torture, Maria was pressured to confess not just to lighting candles, but to a whole catalogue of supposed Jewish practices she had never engaged in. The interrogation records reveal the psychological techniques used to extract confessions. Investigators would claim to already know about the defendant's crimes, suggesting that confession would bring mercy while continued denial would bring harsher punishment. They would present seemingly minor admissions as evidence of major crimes. Admitting to lighting candles became proof of systematic heresy. Maria Gonzalez endured 3 separate torture sessions on the Potro before finally confessing to crimes she had never committed. Her confession implicated dozens of other converso families, creating a cascade of arrests and investigations that destroyed Toledo's entire converso community. Maria herself was sentenced to life imprisonment, but died in the Inquisition's dungeons within 2 years of her trial. But conversos weren't the only targets of Inquisition persecution. The Moriscos, Muslims who had converted to Christianity, faced equally systematic oppression. The conquest of Granada in 1492 had left hundreds of thousands of Muslims under Christian rule. Initially, the surrender terms had guaranteed their right to maintain their religion and customs, but those guarantees lasted less than a decade. Cardinal Cisneros, the same man who helped design the Inquisition's institutional structure, orchestrated a campaign